Welcome, everyone, to our event for International Women's Day, To Build Peace, Include Women, a conversation on human rights, justice, and peace building. I am very excited to welcome an incredible panel. And for those who do not know me, I am Dr. Meghan Clark, an associate professor of moral theology and co-chair of our St. John's CRS Global Campus Committee, along with Victoria O'Keefe, who you can see here. We coordinate a number of lectures and panels and conversations like this one throughout the year to help create more global conversation around global justice events, and also to highlight the important work of issues related to the areas of advocacy on development and justice from our partnership with Catholic Relief Services. As we generally do, before I introduce our panel and we get started, I am going to invite Aislinn, who is one of our student leaders in the CRS Student Ambassador Program, to begin us all with prayer. Ice.
Loving God, you inspire us with love for all persons and concern for the well-being of all creation. Give us today the strength and courage to transform the compassion of our hearts into acts of peace, mercy, and justice. Forgive us the arrogance that leads to moral blindness, for desires for vengeance and retaliation, and for willingness to sacrifice others for our own security and avarice. Help us to renounce all forms of violence, prejudice, unfair allegations, intolerance, and injury. Give us the courage to resist threatening postures, calls to arms, mobilization of troops and weapons, and all actions that threaten the lives and livelihoods of innocent people. Empower us to live out the caring presence of the merciful and generous persons we claim to be. Make us channels of your peace, bearers of healing, women and men who hear and respond with alacrity to pleas for justice in our world. Amen.
Thank you, Ice. We are so incredibly proud of all of the wonderful work that our student ambassadors do. To introduce our panel this morning, we are spanning 3 countries, and just trying to make sure that the setup is working okay in terms of the WebEx settings. We have, and I'll begin in alphabetical order, but then our conversation is going to actually go in reverse alphabetical order. Catherine Baylin Duryea is an assistant professor at the law school, where she researches comparative constitutional development and human rights. Her dissertation in the history department at Stanford University focused on Arab human rights NGOs in the 1970s and 80s. Before joining St. John's, she clerked for the Honorable Edwin Cameron on the Constitutional Court of South Africa. As a law student, she partnered with the American University of Afghanistan to develop a legal education program. Emna Sammari is a lawyer and the general secretary of the Tunisian Association of Defending Individual Liberties. She's a young expert in transitional justice, human rights, and gender in Tunisia, and the laureate of Women of the Mediterranean Program, Sciences, Paris in 2015. She's demonstrated professional involvement in the field of democratic transition and gender. Her interest has consisted of promoting human rights, especially women's rights, but also in fighting impunity and promoting a democratic culture with Tunisian human rights associations. She's worked with different international human rights organizations like UNDP, UNICEF, and others. She was selected as a member of the Tunisian National Technical Committee, which elaborated the Tunisian Transitional Justice Law ratified in 2013. Emna also assisted the Tunisian Truth and Dignity Commission in preparing strategies of investigating gross human rights violations related to women and transferring cases to the specialized criminal chambers, which are created after the revolution in order to prosecute the authors of gross human rights violations. And finally, we welcome Stella Mystica Sabiiti. Spanning several decades, Stella has been involved in providing support to governments, international government institutions, CSOs, and local communities, including pastoral communities, to sharpen their skills in conflict prevention, management, and resolution, as well as stabilization and reconstruction. She has worked at both the policymaking level at the African Union Peace and Security Department as team leader, building the long-term capacity of the AU and regional economic communities, regional mechanisms for the African peace and security architecture, as well as conceptualizing and helping establish the network of African women in conflict preservation and mediation, FemWise Africa, as UN Women Advisor to the AU, and she was responsible for coining that acronym, and previously at the AU Women, Gender, and Development Directorate. Stella's passion lies in facilitating and training of groups, including armed groups from across the globe who are seeking peace, as well as working as a mediator in a field that was and is still almost exclusively male. She promotes working with men and boys, girls and women to create a holistic approach that appreciates the contribution of all genders to peace and security. So I know I speak for everybody who is part of watching our webinar today in saying we are really so honored to have all of you here with us. As we started off, and I sent so that the panelists had a sense of kind of an open-ended first question that I was going to ask each of them. And so I'll begin with Stella. For decades, you have been working on conflict resolution, conflict prevention, and mediation, focusing on the role of women and the importance of including all genders in this work. As we begin today, can you share with us a little of your own story and your experience with the peace process in Uganda and how you ended up choosing this particular focus to work on peace activism? Stella.
Thank you so much, Meghan. Greetings, everyone. Very warm greetings from Uganda. It's now night time. It's quite late. Thank you so much, Meghan, for introducing me. I always thanked God that in 1976, when I was 23 years old in Uganda, I was abducted by soldiers of the president at the time called Idi Amin Dada. So when I was abducted, it gave me the opportunity to feel the soldiers that were doing the harm to me. And I was newly married and also expecting our first baby. But that experience helped me to understand the psyche of the soldiers, and I could see that they didn't like what they were doing to us. In fact, one moving experience was that I started dialogue with the soldiers, and in the end, they called off the operation. And I promised myself, if I survive this and I finish my degree, I will be working with armed groups for peace, and that's what I'm doing. And very unbelievably, 26 years after that, I was appointed to mediate a conflict where the same soldiers were, but this time they were rebels. So in 2002, I helped to bring them to the peace table, and up to now, they're really building peace. I'm not sure if I'm loud enough. I'm seeing some messages coming, but this is what I would like to introduce myself as.
Thank you, Stella. And I'm sure we will have a chance to hear more and to talk a little bit more about your experiences of the peace process. Emna, you have worked on transitional justice with UNDP and other organizations in Tunisia. Can you share a little bit about how you ended up getting involved in transitional justice and how women have been mobilizing for peace and human rights in Tunisia?
Thank you, thank you, Meghan. So, since my first year in the law faculty, I was interested in promoting human rights and especially women's rights. But since we were under the dictatorship, we couldn't do anything. We were oppressed. We had opposition repressed. Everything the liberties were oppressed too. So the revolution of 2011 was my opportunity and all of Tunisians' opportunities to breathe freedom and really to work to build this democracy that we had always dreaming to build. So since that since that event of this social and political change in my country, it pushed me really to defend the rights of victims, and also to help to prosecute, as I am really I am teaching criminal law, so in the Tunisian law faculty. So I really was interested in promoting the fight against impunity, and also to bring prosecutors of human rights violations before the courts. So since that time, I was interested in transition justice, because transition justice, I heard a lot of time and in different conferences, because we had in Tunisia right after the revolution, we had a lot of conferences. So a lot of international organizations, they were talking about transition justice. So I was really interested in this subject, and really I made my research, and it was my topic for my master's degree. And then the Tunisian government, they nominated me as a member of the technical committee, which elaborated the draft of transition justice law. In this committee, I defended the women's rights to be presented in this committee, and also in the Truth Commission, Dignity and Truth Commission. So, and what else? So I had the opportunity to work with the International Center for Transition Justice. We worked really closely with victims groups and human rights association to how to improve their rights in transition justice. And then I had the opportunity to work with UNDP, and especially with the criminal chambers. And I worked to implement these chambers with a lot of Tunisian actors and judges. And now I was so proud when I saw the first, when I attended the first trial of human rights, of the authors of the human rights violations. For the Tunisia, about the women's and human rights, I say that I say always that Tunisia, the secret of the success of the Tunisian revolution among the Arab countries, the other Arab countries, is women, because women, they were active, they were present in every moment, in every political and social movement. Sorry. For example, women, as I said, that women, Tunisian women, they were present in all levels, social and political levels. For example, we had a problem in 2000, really a hard problem in 2012 that blocked all the country. So we had the national dialogue to discuss how we go towards peacefully without conflict. So the quartet, it was composed by a woman and 3 other men. So that's why this quartet that led this peaceful transition to a new government without any conflict, and that's why we got the Nobel Prize in 2015. And also, I have an example for me, and I say always that women are really the spark for the change, and especially in Tunisia, in Arab country, we are always in a framework of stereotypes and the culture of patriarchal culture. For example, we had that the judge, which gave the right to change the sex to men, it was a women judge. So it was a women judge. Even we don't have a legal law that gives the right to this the changing the sex. But this judge, she's women, and really we were so proud because she gave this right under the interpretation of the Constitution of 2014. That's it.
Thank you. So much that we'll have to follow up on. I'm curious to hear a little bit more the impact that it makes, not just in having legal protections, but having women judges and women lawyers and women at the table in a peace process makes a great deal of difference. Part of what Catherine and I talked about when I contacted her about this panel was that most of the stories that we hear, and much of the stories that she's looked at in her research, reveals the faults of what happens in human rights and peace processes when women are not part of the conversation and not included as agents in the process. And so it's important as we talk about this to note both those points of hope, but also the challenges. Catherine, can you share with us a little bit about how you got involved in human rights law and what you saw in practicing human rights for peace in your experiences, whether it be clerking or in your research and teaching?
Sure. So first of all, thank you so much, Meghan, for having me, and to my co-panelists. I'm very honored to be here with both of you. So I actually first got interested in human rights because I was studying in Cairo and a classmate of mine was arrested. This was before the uprisings in 2011. And we mobilized to get him, so he was half Egyptian, half American. And we mobilized once he was arrested to try to get him released from prison. And the whole machinery of the international human rights movement was sort of there to assist us. We had professors who were helping us sort of with community organizing techniques. Like someone from Amnesty just called my cell phone. I don't even know how they got it. And they were like, what do you need? And it worked. We got him out of jail in 4 days. And that was, of course, incredible. But the Egyptians who didn't have an American passport were not released and were treated much more harshly in prison. And so I feel like I got this sort of crash course introduction to both the potential and also the deep inequities of the international human rights movement and how that plays out in a context like in Egypt. And so that really sparked me to pursue a career researching these kinds of topics. And so I'm a historian. And so I'm largely looking at kind of the middle, late 20th century, 70s, 80s, early 90s. And what I've seen in my research, I mean, it's exactly what Emna just said. You couldn't have set that up better, which is that women are always there doing incredibly dangerous edge advocate work, but they're often do pause. Just cut out.
Uh-oh.
Here for just a second.
Catherine, are you still there?
Okay. Everyone's back. I'm going to keep. Yes, I realized I cut out, so I paused for a second. Everyone's back. So what I've seen is that women are often able to do this work precisely because they're women, because they weren't taken seriously, or literally they just weren't seen. So I thought I'd give maybe just two examples of research. And the first is about Kuwait in the Iraqi occupation of the 1990s. Women were central to organizing underground networks of resistance and struggling for rights under the occupation. And they were able to move so much more freely than men because literally their clothing, they could hide things. And because the occupying army was much less likely to like physically search the bodies of women. And so they could move freely around, exchanging letters, communications, supplies in a way that was really unique to kind of a similar Morocco. I'm just going to back in. Megan, can you just confirm if the videos are coming up pretty rapidly? And I
okay, we can hear
you
you again.
Or not.
Now we can hear you.
Okay. All right.
Okay. I want to note for our attendees who are many of whom are St. John's community and many of whom are in other parts of the world. It does figure that it is the connection in the United States that is currently glitching and not the ones from other parts of the world. We can see you again.
Okay. Megan, just let me know if it's too bad. And whether that's completely fine. But until I hear a story of very
Catherine? Maybe it would help if you tried to log back in.
Yeah. Okay, I will do that.
Or maybe
Sorry,
it's her camera.
That maybe if you shut off your audio and just try talking, sometimes that helps.
I can shut off my video. I will log out and log back in. The video.
Because your audio might work for the moment. Sometimes that uses less bandwidth.
No. Okay. Maybe just if you want to go to the speaker. Yeah.
Okay. While she tries to log back in, I want to turn things back to Stella and Emna. One of the threads that came out in both is how important it is that women are part of peace processes and transitional justice, and the what difference it makes when they have a seat at the table. Starting with Stella, you've been involved in multiple examples of these kinds of peace negotiations. In your experience, what difference does it make when women are not only part of the community peace process, which, right, they're generally always on the ground doing that work, But what difference does it make when they're included in the official processes and officially at the table as well?
Meghan, thanks so much. I mean, women do experience conflict differently than men. Men experience conflict in a certain way. They are definitely also 100% affected by the conflict negatively. But so are women, and the women's experience is completely different from that of men. So if we are looking for solutions, why do we leave the women out? That means that 100% of the population is suffering from the conflict, but those responsible for finding solution are actually less than 50%, because we know that worldwide, women as a population, women and girls are larger in numbers than the men. So in order to have a holistic understanding and then also take advantage of everyone's input into finding a solution, we must never leave out the women, we must never leave out the girls, and nor should we leave out the youth. So everyone that has anything to say should be welcomed. And in the African indigenous way of doing this, we sit under the tree, and that means that the space is endless. It anticipates as many people as possible, and everyone is consulted, each from their own background. But unfortunately, in modern day resolving of conflict, where the solution or the space for finding solutions is a small conference room that maybe houses 50, 60 people, or maximum 100, that's not enough. We need to bring these peace processes right down to where the conflict is happening, and on the African continent, that is within the communities and also towns. So it's right down on the ground and not in the boardrooms and also the modern day negotiating tables.
It reminds me of being at a UN meeting in which it was a General Assembly meeting a number of years ago, and it was shortly after the Arab Spring, and it was a young Egyptian woman who had been a medical student who was now a peace activist, and she got up and she challenged the room full of the General Assembly delegates and said, why is it that it seems to me that the price of admission to the peace table is a gun? Why are we being left out? And it was such a powerful moment as I was, sitting there in the back of the room listening to that challenge to the way they think about who gets to be a stakeholder, who gets to have a voice at the table. Emna, and you have been through examples of this as well, and seen a lot of the same things that this young woman was sharing, and the making the claims and the arguments. I mean, you brought up the impact that having a female judge had. What in your experience have you seen about you mentioned that things were peaceful because women were at the table and pushing for revolution and justice. What have you seen since then in terms of the success of really having change in civil society based on the involvement of women?
Thank you, Meghan, again. Okay, so your question is very important and interesting, because you know that also Tunisia is ranked as the first Arab country that gives rights for women, and we had this for more than 50 years. But just after revolution, we had the problem of the debate between the Islamists and the non-Islamists, or the how say I forgot the word. I forgot the word. Anyway, so Islamists and
secularists.
Yes, secularists. Yes, and because the Islamist movement, or they took the power during the 3 years just after the revolution. They wanted to change a lot of things related to women, and especially our rights. For example, they wanted to make the polygamy permitted, where it is prohibited for more than 50 years. And also they wanted to put the Sharia as its source in our constitution. So women, they went in streets, thousands and women, and they went the streets, and they started the debate, and they struggled. We struggled, and even the men were with us to struggle for this right. And it's not a question to take back steps, because really it's not acceptable that what we did for the women for more than 50 years, it will go in just because the Islamists in the power, and we won, and they didn't change it, and they didn't make this law. So we were so proud of us, because it was not a question that we discuss again this kind of rights. Now today, Tunisia, Tunisian women, we are discussing other kind of equalities, like the equality in inheritance, because we are not equal. We don't have the equal as men, because we apply like kind of Islam law, and only in this issue. So also women associations are more active now. We have more than 1,000 associations. They are specialized in women's rights, and yes, that's it.
Thank you. And that is the thing that you see across when you look around the world, is once people have had their rights recognized and been able to participate, it's much harder to take. It's not that they never succeed. I mean, because we certainly know and examples of countries where big steps back happen, big repressions happen. But you also, more often than not, the more open a society is, where people have had the experience of using and expressing their rights, it becomes harder to get them to quietly let you take them away in any real sense. Catherine, hopefully if the audio starts to cut out, I would say just turn off the video and see if that helps. But I want to let you share this concrete story you were trying to share before I ask you anything else.
Sure. Sorry about that. Where did anyone hear anything? Or just give me a sense, Meghan, of where it cut me off.
I would just start the story over. Yeah.
About Morocco?
About Morocco, yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. So what I was starting to share was, in my research, I had the opportunity to speak to a number of Moroccan human rights activists, including several women who were very active in this horribly violent period in Moroccan history known as the Years of Lead. And this woman who I was speaking to was very involved with trade unions, and her husband was imprisoned because of his political beliefs. And so she started organizing family members of people who had been disappeared and imprisoned under the regime. And so this was before email, and this sort of like loose network of human rights activists was trying to get some information out of Morocco to the UN. The only way to do that was using a fax machine, and the only way to get a fax machine was in a fancy hotel. So she described to me how she like put on her nice clothes and put on all this makeup and sort of dressed up like a very wealthy Moroccan woman, and sort of sauntered into this hotel, and I think basically sort of flirted her way into using the fax machine to send this incredibly sensitive human rights information to get it out to a broader audience that could publicize it. And, you know, it's kind of a lighthearted example, but I thought it was just one of the many examples of women doing incredibly important work that they could really only do because they were in these historical contexts, as I said, either not taken seriously or just literally often not seen. But the reason I bring up these examples from Kuwait and Morocco, though, is because when it came time to recover and move and build from these periods of violence, women often found that they just weren't a priority. And so in the example of Kuwait, you know, Emna just said, I think that Tunisian women have had the right to vote for sort of the longest time in the region. Kuwait is on the other side of that. So women in Kuwait were not able to vote until 2006. And there was this huge push. I mean, Kuwaiti women had been advocating for the right to vote since the 70s. And then they were so important in this national kind of uprising and organizing in the early 90s, only to find their calls for suffrage ignored and denied. And in Morocco, it's a bit different. I mean, there's been huge legal developments for women's rights in Morocco, but what I heard from these women were, you know, we were integral parts of this human rights movement, but women's rights really weren't seen as human rights within the human rights movement for a couple of decades, that it really took until the 90s. And so what I've seen as a historian is that, you know, women are there. They step up to fight for their own rights. They're fighting for their families' rights. They're fighting for their nation's rights, but that their contributions are not always recognized historically, either sometimes by their governments or sometimes by their own comrades in organizing. And so when, as Meghan said, when you reached out and I was saying, well, a lot of my research actually shows movements where women were there, but then also excluded. And I think I see a lot of that historically.
Building on that, Stella, it seems like you've been involved in a couple of really important structural examples of trying to fix that with UN Women and the African Union and FemWise. What, from your perspective, what progress do you think has been made in creating more of an institution to help foster that the women don't go unseen and that they do get taken seriously as part of the conversation?
Thank you, Meghan. Actually, the struggle was long and very deep. First of all, to convince these heavy institutions to implement the things that they write down in their frameworks. All those frameworks do exist, but to put them into practice is a struggle. So we had to struggle and demonstrate that without women, you can't succeed. And then eventually we were able to be brought in as experts. So we had to prove ourselves first, which the men don't have to, but we were always forced to prove our capacity and capability. So then, my lesson in there is that when you get an opportunity, use it and surround yourself with very good people, whether men or women. Just surround yourself with good people and get to work. So we built this, the Network of African Women in Conflict Prevention and Mediation, FemWise, because we had realized, we know we're Africans, we live on this continent, and we know that when women step in, you see results. Wonderful things begin to happen. So we demonstrated that, and we opened up the space mainly to bridge the gap between the top level decision makers in peace processes, the middle level, and then the bottom level, the ground level, or the grassroots level. A lot of good work is happening at the grassroots level. Without the women, the conflicts will not be prevented. There will not be positive dialogue, resolution, and reconciliation. So we said, but the leaders, the political leaders, unfortunately miss that because they are not present. And when they make the decisions, the women are shut out. So we built this network of women, so officially at the African Union in the Peace and Security Department, to make sure that women are recognized officially. And we are not saying let women change from where they're active at the grassroots level. Let them stay being effective there, but let their role be acknowledged and let their voice come and feed into the decision-making spaces. And then also that opens up, that network opens up the space for the decision makers to be aware and to be able to interact with women wherever they are at whatever level. So that has brought so many fantastic results. There is still challenges, which we will, I think, discuss later. But we've seen so many great things happening. And for myself, I was able to, as a mediator of military guys who are hardened male fighters, they were able to see me as their mother, as their auntie, although they were older than me. They were way older than me, but they saw me, they saw that I was looking at their heart, I was looking at their soul, I was recognizing myself in them, and I was recognizing themselves in me, and I was able to reach out to them, and that way they trusted me. There are certain things I cannot share now, but when you gain confidence of such groups, then they're able to just flow with it, and that's what we want. If we bring women alone at the peace table and we exclude the men, we miss a point. If we bring men alone to the peace table and we exclude the women and the youth, we also miss the point. So for me, these are the lessons I've learned, and this is why we've struggled to build all these structures and put them to work and make sure that these structures work, not just to remain on paper.
Thank you for sharing that. And it strikes me when it reminds me of each semester I teach theology of peace. We watch Pray the Devil Back to Hell on the Liberian example, and the way in which the women's peace movement, bringing together Christian and Muslim women, were able to navigate the fact that because in some ways, because they otherwise are unseen, they weren't seen as a threat in a way that played into the conflict, but allowed them to mediate in a different way. And yet my students are always caught by the scene and the conflict that happens at the peace talks, where the women refuse, they have a sit-in, and refuse to leave because progress isn't being made, because it's not being taken seriously. And my students always note that, you know, it's amazing what they accomplished, but wouldn't it have been more if they'd also been allowed, they didn't have to sit outside the room and they were also part of the negotiation in the room. And it seems to me that one of the things that ends up being an outcome is that then the scope of what conflict resolution and what mediation is gets shifted and is broader. Emna, you've done some work on the right to a fair trial, and in particular the role of child victims of terrorism within that. And it seems to me that the taking more seriously children within all of these issues is something that just empirically seems to happen when there are more women's voices as part of the table. But also, if what we want is a peace that lasts beyond right now, right, we have to address the next generation, and we have to heal wounds of those who've been the victim of violence as young people. Otherwise, right, we might have a pause, but it'll just all reignite. Could you share a little bit about your work specifically on working with child victims of terrorism and the right to fair processes?
Okay. So, you know that after the revolution of Tunisia, lived a lot of terrorist attacks, had a lot of terrorist attacks, and it was the combat to fight against terrorism. It was so heavy in price, because a lot of liberties were and freedoms were oppressed. To make this balance between the security and the liberties, it is so difficult for a new democracy as Tunisia. So, for example, I had this. I know you know that in cases of terrorism, always women and children, they are touched at first. And for example, in different cases and most of cases, women who were raped by terrorists and even children, they were accused by the state for supporting the terrorism, which was so shocking for me. And they were, for me, it was really a shock, and a lot of human rights activists, especially when you find that these girls are child, like 15 years or 14 years, they were raped by the terrorists, but they were accused by the state for supporting the terrorism. And in this case and different cases, the child's rights were not respected. So the Tunisia didn't respect its commitment to the international conventions of child's rights and the human rights in general. So for me, it was not, and for other activists, it's not really, because this is not Tunisia that we have been dreaming about, the new Tunisia. So we are so proud. We have a constitution that provides and protects all different liberties, individual liberties, and human rights and children rights, but this is only in paper. It's not in practice. So I took the challenge to defend every children and women who were in this kind of case, who were accused by the state for supporting the terrorism, where they are in the same time victim of the state, because these kind of girls or this kind of women, they were in the country, but they were deprived from their rights to education. They were so poor. They were alone, and they were threatened by arms by the terrorists. So I took this challenge as personal, and really I work to that Tunisia respect its commitments to the different international conventions, and I try to make a little bit monitoring of this kind of trials, and to see or to assess to which extent that the state respected this kind of rights or conventions, and also how it respects women as a victim, and how it respects the women, because women, we have special needs, for example, and so that's it. This is because I want to respect the time. I don't know, because 5 minutes, but so this is the challenge for me. So the fair trial is it's not also only terrorism, also for the cases that are prosecuting the former regime. I am trying to do monitoring to which extent the state is respecting human rights, and especially the rights also for perpetrators of human rights violations.
Thank you. It's important work. And before I turn and ask Catherine a related question, I just wanted to say to everybody who's attending, if you have any questions that you would like to ask anyone of the panel, please put it in the chat so that I can see them, or in the Q&A function. Catherine, building on what Emna was talking about, as a historian of these legal processes and having seen on the flip side, right, what a constitutional court looks like and how this all works, where and how do you think international law and these legal processes can help move things from paper to practiced in reality? Is there anything that you've seen that threads through? What from your perspective can make them more effective or kind of seems to be the same when they're not?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a great question. It's also a huge one because, of course, like international legal practice, I mean, it encompasses so many different institutions and tribunals and things that have been, maybe of varying levels of effectiveness and usefulness in different times and places. But what I can say from the places and time periods that I've studied is that these sort of like very formal, very high level international institutions are important for signaling and standard setting, and they kind of create these moments of opportunity, but then the way that those are actually really impactful on the ground is when those sort of spark or provide opportunities for people at a more grassroots level. So like for example, one of the NGOs I studied, actually their first major report, they initially prepared as a report to give at the UN. They went and gave the report at the UN and they were like, it doesn't seem like anyone's going to do anything with this information at the UN, right? I just testified here for like 3 days and nothing's happening. And then they went home and published it as a book that launched significant change in, this is a Palestinian human rights organization. And so it's kind of a story of both about how this like international human rights apparatus was useless, right? In the moment, it was pretty useless to them. But in the long run, actually incredibly important because it provided this moment and this kind of framework for this testimony that then became a really important human rights report. That was the beginning of a bunch of changes within Palestine. And so I think that when you have these really formal institutions that can historically have been very difficult for women to access, right? I think things are a bit different now, as I assume our other speakers will talk about, but that have, I think, historically provided more promise than actual reality of change. But when seen in the long view, often did provide these moments of opportunity where you had, say, like a sudden influx of resources that a national women's NGO was able to turn into a legislative effort to change policy, right? You see moments like that where they can be very effective. But it is a struggle because they're very formal, they're very expensive to access, there's communications barriers, and because of all of the other kind of discrimination that women face, it just becomes even harder for men than men to access those kinds of high level institutions sometimes. So kind of recognizing the promise, but also a lot of challenges and barriers.
Thank you. The one question, and I want to ask a more general question of each of you. But before I do that, having listened to each other's experiences, I'm kind of curious, is there anything that one of your fellow panelists have said that you would want to follow up on or contribute to? So far, I've been kind of asking each of you in particular questions, but I want to give a moment now to see if there's anything that any of you would like to add in order to ask each other or build on what another of your panelists have said. For the most part, I've been hearing the ways in which, right, they thread together these examples from different parts of the world and different experiences. But I also wanted to just see if Stella or Emna want to say anything on what Catherine just said, or, and vice versa in terms of the examples we've been talking about.
Yeah, Meghan, if I can come in just briefly.
Yes.
I've just arrived back to Uganda. Thanks. I've just arrived back to my country, Uganda, from Ethiopia, where I've been working for the last 16 years. And we had a conference, a 1 week, a 3 to 4 day conference. And we were, looking at women's roles in these things, in these processes. And it was very interesting to see that we were women, we had everything in common, but at the same time, our backgrounds were different. And our approach to peace was very different. So those who came in, we had faith-based women, we had a bishop, a female bishop, we had a female canon. We also had women who were lawyers, some who are almost going to be judges. And then you have those who are in the field of peace and security. You have human rights lawyers and so on. And the way we approached this whole thing of involvement of women and youth was so different. And at some point, we would even disagree, although we knew that we were heading the same way. The path was different, but the end point was the same. And sometimes we can fight each other unnecessarily, and we don't realize our main objective of having a role for women and youth to play in peace processes and development and so on. So for me, I would very much like to see the nexus between peace work, mainstream peace work, even faith-based peace work, with peace work done by human rights actors or human rights activists. The approaches are very much different, and I now have, I think, 42 years in this field and working across the whole globe, and I see that challenge always there. We point fingers at human rights workers point fingers at us, and in the end, we don't work and collaborate together. I would like to see that nexus that brings us together enhanced. Thank
you. Catherine, you indicated you wanted to speak up too.
I actually just had a question for my co-panelists, because coming at this very much from the human rights kind of lawyer perspective, I think a lot of human rights activists see themselves as peace builders, even when they're in a moment, it's not a moment of like very overt conflict or post-conflict. But I think both of you, have all this experience with maybe a more traditional like post-conflict peace building kind of effort. And I was very curious to hear what you think of how human rights activism contributes, or maybe doesn't contribute, maybe it's problematic in certain ways, to that kind of work. So if you have human rights activists when there's not necessarily like open armed conflict, right? And then if there is some sort of post-conflict peace building effort, was that human rights work valuable, or what kind of role did it play in the movements that you've been a part of and tried to build in those settings? Or maybe it wasn't helpful, which maybe we're just sort of hearing hints of.
Sorry, Catherine, but I didn't hear your first part of question because there were an interruption of connection. So if would you please repeat the first part of question?
Yeah, in the first part, I was just saying that I'm coming from sort of a human rights perspective, and I think a lot of human rights activists think of themselves as peace builders, even if their society isn't having like an open conflict. And I was just curious about how those efforts, how you have seen those efforts maybe be beneficial or maybe be problematic when it comes to peace building in a conflict or a post-conflict environment.
Personally, I see that it's very beneficial for the peace building, especially from my experience in Tunisia. It's not post-armed conflict, but it's post-political conflict. But women, they were really active, especially in discussing how, for example, to discuss the new constitution. For example, even there is a lot of activism to suggest women as leader in, for example, in a high decision position, for example, the Constitutional Court. So I think that women's activism has a lot of impact on the society and in general. So, for example, when I talk about the example when the Islamists, they wanted to put a lot of things, a lot of laws that are inspired from the Sharia, like the polygamy, and for example, the abolition of adoption. It was not only the women the activists who were in the street, and because there were a lot of women, and this is due to the impact of women as activists who called the citizens to go out in the street. So they have a lot of impact to change the social and also the political life in Tunisia. And also there is an example, for example, we have the rural women who are working in agriculture, and they do not have any protection from the state, and a lot of women, they are dying every year. So it's not only women activists who called for their rights, but due the work that the women association that made all these years, a lot of women who are not activists, but they went the street and they called for their right, for their protection. And now we are discussing a law that is protecting this kind of rural agriculture women.
Meghan?
Yes.
Yeah, yes, I draw a lot of lessons and learnings from my own experience. When I was 23, I was abducted by soldiers of the government of the time, of the day. But 26 years after that, I was mediator, and I was appointed to mediate in a conflict between that same group of people who had tortured me 26 years earlier. They didn't know who I was, but I knew, of course. And I felt so powerful standing there, and I could have done anything, to send them to jail. I could have done anything to revenge. And I love the prayer, the opening prayer that Aislinn gave. I would like to hear more about that prayer. If Meghan, you could share that prayer with us. It was so beautiful that we look at the reasons why human beings commit such atrocities. And this is someone's loving father, someone's loving son. What turns them into doing horrible things? What is that? In the African culture, everybody is responsible for the behavior of everybody else. And that's where they say it takes a village to raise a child. It's because it's everyone's responsibility. And when one person commits an atrocity, everyone who is connected with that person, the family, the clan, the tribe, in our indigenous way of doing things, they all own the wrong that individual has done, because somehow they have betrayed that individual. They haven't prevented or helped that individual from not committing atrocities. So I think that the more we understand about forgiveness, the more we will be focused on prevention. Because most of the time we wait till conflicts and atrocities have been committed. It's so difficult to deal with it. But if we invest more in prevention and open up the space and roles for everyone to play, then if in the end we won't have, be cracking our heads and wondering what on earth happened. Why did this beautiful, fantastic, wonderful human being commit such atrocities?
Thank you. No, that is the question of prevention and forgiveness and reconciliation. It seems like a place, as well as the sense of we're responsible for each other. The prayer that we began with came from the Sisters of Mercy, is who wrote the prayer, the Sisters of Mercy of the Americas. And I selected it when looking because of the way in which it took a holistic approach. And it seems like this is like just as often as the question of peace actors and peace building vis-a-vis human rights actors, there's also the question of where one puts other community organizations like faith-based organizations into the conversation. And this is something that I know Stella has worked on and been part of. We were on a panel together in October that talked about the Security Council resolution on violence against women in conflict, and in particular, that conversation involved questions of how faith-based groups factor into it. And I know Emna she brought up the push in the conflict in terms of the Islamists trying to curtail women's rights. But knowing her a little bit and knowing the movement of those who want to keep a secular government in Tunisia, it's still largely within the context of people who are Muslim. And so I'm going to throw out to anyone on the panel, and I did not warn anyone I would ask this question, but where do you think, and from your experience, where is part of the potential be the role of sometimes maybe officially faith-based groups, but also that some of the potential may not be through official faith-based groups, which still may struggle with gender in a lot of ways, but through communities of faith, and in particular women's communities of faith, as being a place where this coming together and the fostering of really a collective voice for peace and human rights might happen. And I'm gonna kind of throw that out for whoever might want to go first.
This is Stella. I don't see myself anymore. I don't know what I touched, but I hope you can hear me.
We can.
Communities of faith, very good. Communities of faith have played a major role on the African continent. And I'm really very proud to say that they are interfaith, they are cross faiths. We have Muslims, we have Christians, and within Christians, we have Catholics, Protestants. We have all those faith-based communities which come together and work, especially if it's women, they focus on the sisterhood, and they all contribute, especially in opening up the dialogue, community dialogue, or even national dialogues, which are very popular now, but also guarding to make sure that the politicians don't hijack that space. And they're coming in very much together, and they become a kind of role models for others who may not be so strongly based in their faith as a community. And we see this coming up, and especially fighting violent extremism and so on and so forth, which is a threat on our continent, around the whole continent. These faith-based communities are playing a very big and positive role in prevention, in resolution, and in stabilization conversation as well. And then the issue of forgiveness and reconciliation. And I would like to add that some of those things have seeped and found their way through to policy-making level. So we as women who are at policy-making level, we want to have more women come in and join us, but we are also working hand in hand with women at the grassroots level, so that whatever it is they discuss, we bring them, and the other way around. And it's beginning to produce fruits.
Thank you. There's a question from Victoria, but would Catherine or Emna like to say anything about the question on faith-based groups? Catherine looked like she might, so that's why I wanted.
I was just going to say, I really appreciated the way that you framed that question, because I think, you know, a lot of my research has been in particularly Arab countries where it's often set up as like human rights versus Islamists. And I think because we have sort of a limited English vocabulary, right, it's like religion versus secularism. But in fact, many, I'm not going to say all, but many of the human rights activists are very religious people. It's just, and it's much more political, and it's much more, you know, it's more about like sort of a vision of political Islam that's different from this vision that the human rights activists have. But it's not, I think rarely is it really about this like conflict between secularism and religious. Like it's far more political and complicated than that. And I think that particularly in the US, we're very attached to like narratives about oppressed Arab women and like the need to go rescue them. And that plays into our public discourse in very racist ways and Islamophobic ways. And so that, like, I think women and the issue of women's rights is, and how it's often portrayed, particularly in the US, is very problematic in terms of this like perceived conflict between religion and secularism. And so like when I've gotten similar questions in the past, they usually embrace that framework. And I love that you kind of broke that down. We're like, that's not really how it is. Because I think that you see a lot of faith-based groups, of course, all over the world doing this kind of peace building and human rights activism, and maybe using different terminology or different organizational structure, but doing a lot of very similar work.
It's often how and why those in kind of a political realm want to work for human rights and work for greater inclusion of women. Where things often fall flat is because they set up dichotomies that don't seem to recognize that just because a group of women are empowered doesn't mean they're any less women of faith. And just because they're educated and they're politically active doesn't mean they're not women of faith. And that debates within a religious tradition, I mean, you would, in some ways, one need not look very far, but look at US Catholicism and the divergences about what is an internal debate about how to approach involvement in the US public system, in terms of the amount of Catholics that were supporting the previous administration and Donald Trump versus Joe Biden as a devout Catholic who's now a very different version of Catholicism and social approach to civil government. And so the simplification that then gets exported onto looking at other places as if they have no real complexity, or as if faith is what we're trying to get people out of. As a theologian, that obviously bothers me, but it betrays a naivete and I think almost a willful ignorance about the active role that communities of faith play in community building across the spectrum. About, you know, who's doing the work on the grassroots is often community organizations that are deeply rooted in their cultural values and their faith traditions. And so we're always going to be in danger when we set up our understanding of human rights as something that is other to, right, the very deep identity that's at the center of who communities see themselves as being. It's one of the things that this all of this is part of our efforts that came out of our partnership with Catholic Relief Services. And one of the things that I admire so much about being a partner with CRS is the fact that on the one hand, it's a very clear outward expression of, I am a Catholic theologian, right? So a very outward expression of what faith means for the US church, but it also is completely irrelevant to wherever CRS goes and what they're doing, what religious tradition the people that they are working with in a particular crisis or development context are, right? That they operate the way that they do because of the faith of the Catholic Church, in terms of this is a development arm of the US Church, but it doesn't go around the world seeking to make Catholics or seeking to only help Catholics, because, right, so all of its efforts end up being deeply interreligious and somewhat more productive, because when you start at that position, you're less threatened by and more open to taking seriously the faith of your community partners and how that might be shared across. There's a question in the chat that I want from Victoria that I want to ask before I ask my last question, which is to end on a note of hope. But Victoria noted that when Emna was speaking about rape victims being blamed as supporters of their attackers, that she saw you, Stella, almost have a visceral reaction of agreement seeing that. And she asked what might need to be done to reorient the ways in which women are seen, that contributes to this distorted perception in which, in particular, when they are the victims of violence, they're blamed for it. And what maybe can we do to help shift that, get rid of that particularly dangerous perception? Emna, if you'd like to start.
I'm trying really to organize my ideas because I have a lot of ideas to say about this question. Thank you, Victoria, for this question. What we can do, for example, for our situation, our Tunisian law, the counter-terrorism law, it is not a law that respects human rights and women's rights and children's rights. It's working only to protect the state, the security of the state. So for me, it's the solution is to work to struggle and to advocate to modify this law with protecting more women and children, especially in this kind of case, because I was, as I told you, that I was shocked when I heard that they were accused for supporting because they gave their body. For them, it was like a kind of support. So it was, for me, it's a shock because they were raped under armed and threatened. So there is no kind of legal protection in this law. Not a lot of human rights associations. They really they are doing, and we are still doing a lot of work to really to modify this law, to respect more victims of terrorism, and to consider this kind of rape or victim or children as victims, and they need really protection from the state. They need a lot of specific how to say specific. But I forgot the word, but really In this situation, we are working to modify this law to protect more this kind of victims, especially victims of rape and violence based, gender-based violence.
Thank you. Stella, is there anything you'd like to add?
Okay, yeah, thank you, Meghan. Yes, for I need to put the work of CIA and that's what we find still working on civil society some years back. They supported work in communities with indigenous leaders, traditional leaders who were from faiths, the indigenous faith. The CRS didn't discriminate, wasn't trying to baptize anyone or anything. They were trying to bring voice and those indigenous religious leaders do a good job, especially in northern Uganda, excuse me, where the Lord's Resistance Army by Joseph Kony was committing horrendous activities against people. I think also just asked, it's the structure that human beings have built. Men have features that are leading us, that we are using as tools to manage and organize our lives socially, politically, economically. And really, these structures are not serving the purpose that they should be serving. To such an extent that structures intact, which are male, because of the patriarchal system, which have encouraged which have also communities to interfere. If you live in those structures and you bring women into them and youth, the successes will not be visible because the structures are so strong and so negative. We're trying to fit we're trying to fit I'm now being like Emna now. I'm looking for the right word. We have square pegs to fit them
in a certain round hole.
Holes, and it's not working. We have we round hole and square pins. We cannot succeed. We have to change the whole thing. We have to change the whole thing. And I'm always surrounded by men in my work, as you introduced me, Meghan. He said, I'm men. I get challenged so often, and I see where things should move and be changed. It's difficult to change them because the structures are so old, so deeply entrenched, and the men who realize that actually should act and let women in, do it. If we are seeing women and youth, we look chicken. We're supposed to be tough. So the men are also held prisoner by the structures that they have built. And we have to move to make sure that we help to change the structures. They are invisible, but very invasive. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, no, it isn't just bringing women into the established systems that we've got, because those systems created the injustices and the exclusion that we've got. We need to imagine new and different ways of proceeding, of being community, of being transnational communities. I want to say that I put in the chat for those who are attending, CRS currently has, in particular, is asking people to call their US congressmen and senators about making sure that the development aid is protected in the current debates about COVID-19 relief. And this came up a little bit in terms of an example about agriculture, but the pandemic is really creating the conditions where many places and many communities will be much more precarious if the funding for community building programs that exist now disappears because everybody's trying to manage the pandemic. I was going to ask as the final word to share what gives you hope about the role of women in human rights and peace. But we just got in a question from Anna Zach in our Academic Service Learning Office that asks, what advice to female students looking to engage in peace building and human rights work would you give? And so I'll frame it that way. If you were to give one piece of advice, especially to our undergraduate students who might be interested in getting involved and working for peace building and human rights and justice, what is one piece of advice you would give them? We can start with Catherine and then Emna and then end with Stella.
Sure. Thank you for those good questions. And I'll try to answer both in one, actually, because my piece of advice would be to build community where you are. I think particularly if we're talking to American undergrads, we tend to think of peace building as something that happens elsewhere, but it's not. It's something that happens in all of our communities. And I think that by looking inward and looking around you and building community and with other peace builders where you are, that will both, build the skills and of course also you're most effective in making change in your own community. And to tie that into Meghan's question, what gives me hope is all the organizations that I studied were all founded by men. And except for one, they've all now had a female leader, and it was women who got involved in their communities because their husbands were in prison, and then they mobilized all of the spouses. And then 20 years later, right, they're leading the NGO or they're the president of their local section. And you see how those steps they took when they were quite young to build the kind of social community and social organizing skills that the men might have gotten elsewhere through more formal training, that how those ended up being really important to how their countries defined human rights and how their organizations kind of did human rights work. So that would be my advice and why I hold on to optimism in an otherwise sometimes depressing world. I'll hand it over to Emna. Yeah, there you go.
Great advice, Catherine. So my piece of advice is don't underestimate yourself. You can make the change, and don't listen to all stereotypes that you are female, you can't do it. You can do it if you believe in yourself. It's normal to be stressed a little bit, but it's good to start, and also the most important is to really to have women and people who can give you inspiration for this kind of activism, and you can build your own network with this kind of people. My answer to Meghan question is my hope, the greatest hope for women in human rights, it's all women who suffered from discrimination and who are now in a position of decision making, and who, for example, who won all women who won the Nobel Prizes, like that woman which called for the right of Yazidis, and Tawakkul Kurman from Yemen. So for me, they are the hope for women's rights, and also now all women who are now working and struggling for this period, in this period of pandemic, especially the doctors, women doctors. Before we say that no, women, they can't do that, they must stay in home, in their house with their kids, but now women, they can do the balance and between their work and their families. That's it.
Thank you. And Stella.
Yeah, thank you so much for everyone who has given us questions and shared your ideas. Today is International Women's Day, and the African Union Women, Peace and Security program within the Peace and Security Department has hashtags, and one of them is choose to challenge. Choose to challenge. So don't be scared, don't be worried. There is a whole group of people out there that would support you, and build coalitions with others. Build coalitions, build your strength. And for me, maybe the hope is, because I've talked about men as well and boys, I realize that men and boys are also victims of especially the structures that they have built or were built by men in the past throughout history. Like Catherine is a historian, she realizes that. I mean, she has done studies in history. So I'd like to draw the attention, so I'm also asking the two, to the students, please study the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325, which is bringing us together today. But then beyond that, look at United Nations Security Council Resolution 2106 of 2013, the year 2013, so a few years ago. It talks about men as victims of sexual violence. That is something that we don't talk about. So when men see us struggling for women and youth, and we take them as if they're the only ones, we are the only ones suffering and not them, it brings backlash against us. Please also read United Nations Security Council Resolution 2242 of the year 2015, so a few years ago. It talks about men and women, men as partners. So it is addressing us as women, that we need to work with men and also acknowledge the fact that they are also suffering. And then there is United Nations Security Council Resolution 2467, which was passed in 2019, so very recently. And it challenges the cultural assumptions that men are not vulnerable during situations of conflict. Let's say in everyday life, but especially during war, during upheaval, men also are vulnerable. So if we realize that we need to come together and we need to have empathy and acknowledge how others are suffering, we'll get somewhere. And finally, if you look at United Nations Security Council Resolution 2457 of February 2019 also, it's talking about silencing the gun. And this is about Africa. So you will read all about the African peace and security architecture that Meghan introduced me as leading, and also FEMWISE, the Network of African Women in Conflict Prevention and Resolution, including also the Network of Women in Leadership. We want to bring a holistic way of bringing peace so that both men, women, girls, and boys enjoy this beautiful world that God gave us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Stella. That's a beautiful way for us to conclude. We are out of time, and in the chat, an attendee posted, "Thank you for your bravery. Because of your efforts," meaning the panel, "the road ahead looks a little bit brighter." And so that seems like a good way for us to end, and for me to thank our wonderful panel of such accomplished scholars and activists. Thank you so much for spending part of International Women's Day with us. And I hope that on the other side of COVID, we all may be in conversations with each other again soon, and perhaps even in person. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Meghan, for having us. Really, it was really a good opportunity, and to discuss with these amazing women, and especially maybe Stella, one day you can tell us the story of your abduction. I really I'm interested to hear it, and really you are brave, and congratulations. Thank you, Catherine, for your research and everything, and thank you for the audience too.
No, I felt very in awe of my co-panelists. So thank you for allowing me, the academic who studies these things, to participate in the conversation. I really learned so much from both of you. So thank you, and of course to Meghan and everyone who organized, and ICE for the beautiful prayer, and thank you to all those behind the scenes making this happen.
Thank you.
Thank you.